the French resistance was gaining strength, and on the Soviet-German front the war was already in full swing. 30 a.m. on June 22, Hitler's army began its invasion of the Soviet Union in the western and northern directions. Roger Serrate, assessing the German forces, calls 120 line infantry and 70 tank and airborne divisions. Since the beginning of 1940, the Wehrmacht's strength has increased by 3.5 million men. In June 1941, the German army numbered 8.5 million people, including 6 million in the land forces, 1.7 million in aviation. To this should be added 900,000 soldiers of Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Italy, which also participated in the hostilities on the Soviet-German front. At the same time, the Nazis were forced to keep 60 divisions in France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway, as well as 7 divisions in the Balkans, particularly in Yugoslavia. In addition, 2 German divisions were fighting alongside Italian troops in Libya. In the 2 years leading up to the war, the USSR made a huge effort and achieved much. Seeking to win the longest possible respite, it prepared for defense. The chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USRM, I. Kalinin, in his speech on November 7, 1940, dedicated to the 23rd anniversary of the October Revolution, in the conflagration of war that has engulfed the whole world, the USSR cannot be content with the role of an outside observer. The task of every Soviet citizen is to strengthen the economic and military power of his country. In March 1941, D.Z. Maniulski, Secretary of the Comintern and later Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, stated that war with Nazi Germany is almost inevitable. 3 months before the German attack, a non-aggression pact was signed between the USSR and Japan. It was destined to play an important role during the Soviet counter-offensive near Moscow in the winter of 1940. It made it possible to introduce into the battle a large number of divisions transferred from the Far East. The USSR has always shown concern for the defense of its borders. From 1917 to 1940, the USSR, under conditions of deprivation and hardship, which no other state has known, managed to overcome economic backwardness and turned into a powerful advanced power of the world. In the course of implementing the Great 5-Year Plans, it created a powerful heavy industry, thus ensuring its economic independence, and laid the foundation for the defense power of the state. Hitler at this time converted all German industry to war. The entire Nazi economy was subordinated to military objectives and Hitler's strategy of lightning war. 2 socio-economic systems came into collision. On the one hand was the people who had given the world great people in all fields of knowledge in the past, such as Goethe, Schiller, Hegel, Kant, Marx, Engels, Beethoven, Heine, Thomas Mann, Lessing, Einstein, and turned by the Nazis into obedient executors of their will, into wild beasts in human form, with their theory of racial superiority. On the other, in contrast to these killing mechanisms, stood a nation of creators, highly educated, formerly illiterate, who in less than 23 years turned into students of labor and into working students, and they transformed the country, mastered all the necessary knowledge, developed this knowledge further. This people and its younger generation, born of the Great October of 1917 in Russia, inspired by an unshakable faith in man, freed from the shackles of exploitation and the oppression of terrorism, saw themselves as agents of a great mission and bearers of a great ideal. It is this new humanism that Alexander Wirth has in mind when he quotes the words of a Soviet officer with whom he spoke at the front near Smolensk. This is a very hard war, and you cannot imagine what hatred the German fascists have awakened in our people. I have never felt such hatred before, and there is every reason for it. Think of all these towns and villages. Think of the agony and humiliation that our people endure. Remarkable words. In the midst of battle, the officer bitterly says that the humanism of Soviet soldiers is opposed to war and the beastly nature of Nazism. Hitler and his accomplices could not understand what the spiritual strength of the Soviet people. In the days of 1941, the eyes of all the peoples of Europe, humiliated and trampled by the Nazi boot, were turned to the east. They closely followed the course of the battle on the Soviet-German front. In this tragic time, we witnessed countless examples of heroism and courage of army fighters, partisans and partisan women. Surrounded from all sides and continuously bombarded Brest Fortress was defended for exactly 1 month. It was captured only when all its defenders were killed or seriously wounded. These soldiers, dead and survivors, fulfilled an important task. They chained to themselves large forces of the enemy, delayed his rapid advance. Heroism and courage distinguished those who evacuated factories to the Urals and other regions in severe cold weather and put them into operation, working voluntarily to exhaustion around the clock and producing modern weapons and ammunition necessary for the front. Alexander Worth writes that American, British, and Canadian aid, according to the U.S. Estate Planning Committee, in 1941-1943, amounted to only 4% of all Soviet production. Heavy weapons supplied by the Allies amounted to about 10–15% of the total. In 1942, Allied aid was certainly not taken particularly seriously. In 1941–1942, deliveries from America of cargoes amounted to only 1.2 million tons, and deliveries from England 532,000 tons. Some heavy armaments received in this year were unsatisfactory. Only in 1943, the assistance became more tangible, and still it was a small proportion of the total weapons and ammunition received by the Red Army. The Soviet Union produced in the last 3 years of the war 100,000 tanks, 120,000 airplanes, 360,000 guns, etc. Soviet soldiers receiving American canned pork, Stu jokingly said, "So much for the Second Front." In the early days of the war, the Soviets were encouraged by a speech Winston Churchill gave on London radio on the evening of June 22. The Soviets were not alone. Churchill said in his moving speech, "I see Russians, soldiers, standing on the threshold of their native land. I see them guarding their homes, where their mothers and wives are praying, yes, for there are times when everyone prays. For the safety of their loved ones, I see tens of thousands of Russian villages, where livelihoods are being wrested from the earth with such difficulty, but where native human joys exist, where girls laugh and children play. I see the vile Nazi war machine looming over all this." A few hours after the aggression began on the Sunday morning of June 22, the Soviet government issued a statement by V.M. Molotov. On July 3, 1941, 12 days after the outbreak of hostilities, Stalin made a speech. Alexander Worth describes the address this way. Stalin spoke deftly and slowly, with a strong Georgian accent. Once in the middle of the speech, you could hear him clinking his glass to drink water. Stalin's voice was low, soft, and could seem completely calm, if it were not for the heavy, tired breathing and not this water, which he began to drink during the speech. The strongest impression was made by the opening words. "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of our army and navy, I am addressing you, my friends. By virtue of the war imposed on us, our country has entered into mortal combat with its worst and most insidious enemy, German fascism. Our troops are heroically fighting the enemy, armed to the teeth with tanks and aircraft. The main forces of the Red Army, armed with thousands of tanks and planes, are entering the battle. Together with the Red Army, the entire Soviet people are rising to defend their homeland. The enemy is cruel and inexorable. He aims at seizing our lands, seizing our bread and our oil. He aims at restoring the power of the landlords, restoring Tsarism, destroying the national culture of the peoples of the Soviet Union, turning them into slaves of German princes and barons. It is necessary that in our ranks there was no place for whiners and cowards, panickers and deserters, that our people knew no fear in the struggle and selflessly went to our national war of liberation against the fascist enslavers. During the forced withdrawal of the Red Army units, it is necessary to hijack the entire rolling stock, not to leave to the enemy not a single locomotive, not a single car, not to leave to the enemy not a kilogram of bread, not a liter of fuel. Collective farmers should steal all livestock. Bread should be handed over to the state authorities for transportation to the rear areas. All valuable property, including non-ferrous metals, bread and fuel, which cannot be taken out, must be unconditionally destroyed. In the areas commandeered by the enemy should be created partisan detachments. To create sabotage groups to fight with parts of the enemy army, to incite guerrilla warfare everywhere and anywhere, to blow up bridges, roads, damage telephone or telegraph communications, burning forests, 63 warehouses and wagons, in the captured areas to create unbearable conditions for the enemy and all his accomplices, to pursue and destroy them at every step. All the forces of the people, to defeat the enemy. Forward for our victory, With 64, Stalin showed unvarnished the seriousness of the situation. He did not hide anything, and at the end of the speech formulated combat tasks. His speech gave the Soviet people a charge of energy. Deeply echeloned defense took more and more systematic nature. The advance of German troops held back. English military theorist Fuller points. The fighting in Russia was completely different from those in Poland and France. It seemed that the plan of lightning war was successfully carried out beyond all expectations, but on the Russian front and in his rear was not or almost no panic. German theoretician General Tippelskirch, a participant in the war, supplements this assessment. We Mememi resisted with amazing tenacity. We met an enemy with an iron will. There could be no question of destroying the House of Cards lightning strike 65. As the creation and strengthening of a deeply echeloned defence of the Red Army front, German troops are increasingly stretched in the vast expanse of the USSR. The strength of the blow weakened, despite the introduction of new divisions in the fight. The Nazis had to spend a lot of time to supply their troops with the products of the Ruhr Basin. To get from there to the front, cargo-wheeled transport was on the road for about 2 months. It absorbed much of the scarce fuel that the tanks were waiting for, and that was in short supply in Germany. In August 1941, in this respect, things were much better for the Germans. The offensive was developing in the direction of Leningrad and in the Ukraine. A stubborn battle was unfolding in the area of Smolensk. At this time, northwest of Smolensk, in the area of Rudnya, for the first time were used the famous Katyusha Guards mortars. In one salvo, each unit fired simultaneously a dozen shells. This weapon became known as Stalin's organ. Marshal Eremenko describes the first use of Katyusha as follows. July 15, 1941. In the afternoon, the unaccustomed roar of rocket mines shook the air. Like red-tailed comets, the mines rushed upward. Frequent and powerful bursts struck the ear and sight with a strong rumble and dazzling brilliance. The effect of simultaneous bursting of 320 mines within 26 seconds exceeded all expectations. The enemy soldiers, in panic, rushed to the rear, fell back, and our soldiers, who were on the front line near the ruptures 66. Fighting for Yelnya east of Smolensk continued throughout August and ended only in early September 1941. For the first time since 1939, the Nazi army retreated, leaving an area of 60,000 square kilometers. It wasn't much, but it was the first time it had succeeded in forcing the Wehrmacht to surrender territory. It had spent weeks to capture. The myth of the invincibility of the army was dispelled into ashes. The honorary Inspector General of the French State Archives, Marcel Bourdot, in the magazine La Revue d'Histoire de la Seconde Guerre Mondiale No. 62 for October 1966, gave an analysis of French public opinion in both zones on the eve of Hitler's invasion of Russia, on the basis of a large number of reports that were submitted at that time by the prefects. Communist propaganda received special attention in the reports of all the prefects. Marcel Bourdot characterizes the opinion of these officials as follows. In view of the intensified repression in December 1940 and January 1941 undertaken by the Vichy government, in February, March and April 1941, propaganda work against the occupiers and collaborators fell off sharply. The reports sound differently in May 1941. At this time, there is a miners' strike in the industrial basin of the Nord and Pas-de-Calais. There are major unrest in the departments of Nord, Tarn, Loire, and elsewhere. Depending on whether these reports came from the occupied zone or from the southern, unoccupied zone, they reflected 2 strands of public opinion. In the southern zone, the bet is made that the exhaustion of Germany and Russia in the war creates favourable conditions for England and America. In the northern zone, exasperation with the behaviour of the occupiers takes precedence over fear of Bolshevism. Finally, Marcel Bourdot points out that on December 31, 1941, the Vichyists officially introduced the control of postal correspondence. Here's what one of the letters said. The USSR has become the only hope of all workers and patriots. The cause of Russia and France has merged. The Franco-German policy of Marshal Pétain is almost unanimously condemned. After June 22, 1941, examples of heroism and courage of Russian patriots inspire faith in the hearts of the French, and this leads to the restoration of the unity of the people of France. A letter from an officer in a prisoner of war camp near Berlin stated, Despite the successes of the Nazis, the entry into the struggle of the Soviet Union already, in the first phase of the war, opened the eyes of many, strengthened hope and placed many hesitant ones in the ranks of the resistance fighters. I believe that it is still necessary to soften some of the conclusions from the postal probing of public opinion, or rather, it is necessary to supplement it. For example, when it is said that the Franco-German policy of Marshal Pétain is almost unanimously condemned, one must not forget that Pétain enjoyed in 1941, and unfortunately, for a long time afterwards, great authority, and that he put all his influence at the service of the enemy. It is safe to say that all Frenchmen, with the exception of a bunch of pro-Nazi detractors, wished the Germans' defeat. Marcel Dier on this occasion pours out his indignation in the newspaper Le Vivre for July 1, 1941. The most terrible thing in these troubled times is that the petit bourgeois rubs his hands together with joy at the news of the Soviet Union's entry into the war, while he immediately barricades himself in his own house and calls the police for help if a cocotte from the nearest suburb lets out a scream in the street. In 1940, England had not capitulated. It was waging war in the air, on the soil of Africa and on the seas. However, to defeat the huge Hitler's army occupying Europe, relying on the industry of its own country, mobilizing all the resources of its satellites, required a great state and a powerful army on the continent. It was the USSR that was such a state and had such an army. And there was not a single Frenchman worthy of the name who, with a thought of France and human pride, from the depths of his heart, would not say, only if the Russians had stood firm. And this was happening at a time when the Nazis were on the offensive against Moscow and Leningrad and had penetrated deeply into the Ukraine. But such sentiments alone were not enough. For our own liberation we had to launch the struggle on a proper scale. Of great importance were all our actions, because they kept the German troops in France, and this was an invaluable help to the Soviet people, who fought the hardest battle in our common interests. The resistance movement of the peoples of occupied Europe in 1941 constituted a potential second front. The Nazis were forced to keep 67 divisions here. After the Soviet-German front, this front was the main front. The moral resistance coming from the bowels of our nation needed to be converted into action. But for this potential front to turn into a true second front of the nations, we had to wait for the Allied landings, and unfortunately it took 3 whole years. In the course of the deployment of guerrilla warfare in the Paris area, our groups conducted successful actions in the industrial basin of the Nord and Pas de Calais. Madeleine Venson, the plenipotentiary of the Communist Youth Organization of this important interregion, gave me all the necessary instructions to make contact with comrades from the departments of Nord and Pas de Calais and to cross the border between the zones at Amiens. The Nord and Pas de Calais were then a forbidden zone, and in order to cross the real border, created in the heart of France, one had to have a pass issued by the Germans. To get into the forbidden zone, I travelled by train to Amiens. There I was given the address of a railroad worker. I never met this wonderful brave comrade again, nor the others who succeeded him on my many trips. In the evening he invited me to his house for dinner. Before curfew we went out to the marshalling station where the freight trains were standing. My conductor introduced me to some railroad man, after which I settled down in the brake conductor's booth. I had to stay there for several hours. At night a steam locomotive was attached to the train. At dawn I arrived at Arras. I had no trouble jumping off the train from the opposite side of the platform. Madeleine Venson and René Lalonde, secretary of the Pas de Calais Communist Youth Organization, did their job accurately. Thereafter, from 1941 to June 1944, I had to travel to Nord and Pas de Calais many times. The first trip was quite comfortable, but in winter, in snow, rain and cold, things were different. Our comrades from Nord and Pas de Calais, commissioners and liaisons, made the journey several times a month. In Arras I took the train to Lens. From there I took a bus to Gerson-Coupigny in the mining basin, and there I found the place I wanted without difficulty. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was a café. A young man was waiting for me there, and we bicycled to Auchel. The first appointment was at Benoit Barbier's, where my companion went. Then I was finally introduced to the 2 commissioners of the battalions of youth, Louis Meisen and Michael Brühl. After a major miners' strike, Michel did not return to the Dago mine. He went illegal and, at his request, was assigned to the battalions of youth. Madeleine Venson and André Leroy, among others, gave me a special assignment. to meet a member of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth who refused to participate in political and militant work. In 1941, I was unable to persuade my comrade to join us. He received me very warmly, but refused to participate in the resistance. Such examples were very few. 23 members of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth were killed. Nord and Pas-de-Calais were the cradle of the resistance since 1940, together with the Paris district. It was here that the first battles of the frontières took place. Madeleine Vincennes appointed here such commissioners who had already proved their courage in practice. After the May-June 1941 strike, 500 people were arrested, and among them many real activists. To replace them, many active and courageous people joined the special organization, led by Georges Capel and the battalions of youth of Louis Maison and Michael Brühl. Of the many operations carried out by the battalions of youth up to this time, I will cite only a few examples. In late June, early July, René Lone and Michel Brühl committed sabotage on the railroad dirge. Drocourt derailed a train with materials intended for the factory in Vendin-Lévis, working for the German army. In July 1941, a sabotage was staged on the Arras-Vimy Railroad. The operation was successful, but it cost the lives of our comrades Marcel Dandré and Albert Becker. They had taken cover near the railroad bed in anticipation of an explosion. The explosive device under the locomotive did not work. Then Marcel Dandré rushed to the railroad track and managed to detonate the explosive device, but he was killed. Albert Becker also failed to escape. Despite the petitions and protests of the population, he was shot in Arras on August 21, 1941. It happened at the very moment when Fabian shot a German officer in Paris. After the tragic death of Marcel Dandré in July 1941, another drama took place in Annay. This time the plan was to blow up the cooling water system for the power station. The mission was very important. Putting the power plant out of operation was necessary to stop the output of industrial products going to the enemy. At first everything went according to plan. The explosives were laid in accordance with all the rules, but our young franchiers, brave and impatient, it seemed that the charge took too long to detonate. Joanne, who had taken part in the operation, could not resist going up to the charge. At that time, an explosion occurred, and the Patriot was killed. In July, Germain Debureau, Adolphe Legrand, Séraphine Escajado, Kunda and other members of Popov's group sabotaged mine number 4 in Salamine, while Michel Brühl, Laurent Letimer from Genin Liotard and Joseph Delobel from Noël Godot at the same time blew up 2 transmission towers between Garnes and Genin Liotard. Both operations were successful. Joseph Delobel carried out more than one sabotage on Nazi army communication lines and industrial plants. During another operation in the spring of 1942, he was captured with his brother and shot. On July 16, 1942, he sent the following letter from the prison in Arras. It is with pain in my heart that I write to my family, our great party and the Union of Communist Youth these last lines on behalf of all my comrades, victims of the Teutonic barbarians. All of us were arrested at the end of April and the beginning of May 1942. For the first 2 weeks we were interrogated continuously, each interrogation accompanied by barbaric beatings. We knew that during the interrogations we would receive a portion of blows with a stick with a nail on the end, or a whip, or a knotted club. Our great friend Ignace Humblo died in his cell. His spine was broken from the blows and he received no medical attention, and all this for not betraying his comrades. Remember always this brave man. The courage and bravery of our communist comrades make me happy. My dear comrades, rest assured that we will fulfill our duty to the end without regretting anything. We have been good soldiers of the party and of France. Let our lives serve as an example. Let France live, and let our great party take its proper place in a better state system where the will of the working people will prevail. In this last hour of life we are comforted by the fact that Hitler's offensive has failed, that the valiant Red Army has stopped his impulse and is gradually wearing down his forces. Our victory is inevitable. Soon Nazism and fascism will disappear forever. Comrades, my good friends, bidding you farewell, I assure you that all of us together, brothers in misfortune, will go to the execution with our heads held high, with clenched fists, proclaiming with all our might, long live the great Communist Party, long live my relatives and friends. I am glad I could write this letter to you and my comrades. Courage, farewell, Joseph Delobel. One could cite thousands of similar letters from equally honourable and courageous fighting men and women. Thousands will die before the dawn of freedom rises. It was these fighters who rose before its first rays appeared and prepared the sprouts of 1944. Before leaving Paris, I had a rather lengthy conversation with Madeleine Venson and André Leroy. I always remember André's words about the extraordinary courage of the youth of the Pas-de-Calais department and personally witnessed the massive heroism of both the young patriots and those who were older. This district has been invaded 3 times, and 3 times the patriots have risen to the challenge. Under the leadership of Madeleine Venson, commissioner of this interregion, the Martel brothers, Félicien Joly, Eusebio Ferrari, René Denis, the Vrido brothers and Armand Powski worked in the Department of Nord. In the Pas-de-Calais department, Julien Gapiot, the Camfin brothers, René Lillon, the Delvale brothers, Michel Brul, Augustin Delarue, Louis Moison, and many other outstanding young activists were active. André Leroy and Madeleine Venson understood that we needed to pay serious attention to improving our technical training. Courage must be combined with good combat training to withstand a long and hard struggle with the enemy and to strike at him as many blows as possible. It is necessary to combine a real military organization with voluntary conscious discipline. This is what was discussed in August 1941 during my meeting with comrades from the Pas-de-Calais department. I believed that we were not responding fully to Hitler's terror, to shootings, to repression. We were striking few blows against fighting posts, against detachments, against German officers. In Paris, our doubts and hesitations showed themselves more than in any other place. In the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais, national feeling was particularly strong, and this could only be fully manifested in open combat with the occupiers. It was Popov's group that, at the end of August 1941, lived up to our expectations and engaged directly with the Wehrmacht. There was a café for German soldiers in Jenen-Littert. One evening, when the café was particularly crowded, Popov's group, led by Michael Brul and Kunda, threw grenades into the room. Many German officers and soldiers were killed. At the same time, operations were carried out on the communication routes and to undermine the industrial potential of the enemy. Michel Brul, Louis Moison, Léon Gournay and his brother-in-law derailed a train with German military equipment on the line Lens, Lille. In August 1941, battalions of youth destroyed 2 supports of the power line in Méricourt, which supplied electricity to the German bases in Saint-Omer. Alas, today we can count the survivors of those first operations on our fingers. They were all sons of the night in which they died to make the sun rise over the heads of all Frenchmen. From the department of Pas-de-Calais, I went to the department of Nord. There I was to meet Eusebio Ferrari and Félicien Joly. Félicien Joly, former secretary of the Communist Youth Organization in the Nord Department, was political commissar of the battalions of youth and fought in the ranks of the Frontières. He was arrested on September 18, and his execution on November 15, 1941 was a heavy blow to the organization. Eusebio Ferrari was characterized by unparalleled courage. He was made for active struggle. He was the Fabien of Paris in the department of Nord. The same indomitable courage, the same flexible mind, the same deep, unwavering loyalty to his ideals. Before the war, Eusebio Ferrari and his family lived in Fenina. His parents, Italian anti-fascists, in 1923 were forced to flee the Mussolini regime. Eusebio was 4 years old at the time. He grew up among the children of Fenen workers, where power was in the hands of communist deputies. Being extremely capable, he constantly improved his knowledge. He himself designed detector receivers, without taking time off from work, received a secondary technical education. In 1936, he joined the Union of Communist Youth. In his opinion, the Popular Front was a powerful force in a world full of upheaval. So in front of me was one of the young heroes of the battalions of youth, entirely dedicated to labour, study and his ideal. On July 28, 1941, in Lille 3 weeks before Fabien's feat, Eusebio Ferrari killed the first officer on his account. It happened on the quiet Rue de Paris. It was the 3 of them, Eusebio, René Denis and Jules Bradieu. 3 Nazi officers were approaching them, and the patriots opened fire. René Denis's gun misfired. 2 of the occupying officers were down, the 3rd rushed on. This industrial area, with many dozens of friends always ready to shelter them, became at that time the favourite place of Eusebio and his comrades. On August 27, René Dennis, Jules and André Bridoux, together with Félicien Joly in the Rima forest, derailed a train carrying German troops bound for Germany. The sabotage was carried out with explosives. The detonator was connected by wires to the battery, which ensured that the charge was detonated at the right moment. Hiding in the thicket of the forest, like hunters guarding their prey, a group of battalions of youth waited for the arrival of the train, which was reported by the railroad workers. The steam locomotive reached the point where the charge was laid, and an explosion was heard. As a result of the successful sabotage, the Wehrmacht suffered heavy casualties. The waterways in the Department of Nord were also an important line of communication that carried goods to Germany. Ferrari and his friends blew up the locks on the Escaut River near Marchiennes and on the Escaut Canal near Cabrit, interrupting ship traffic for a long time. One night, Félicien Joly and Eusebio Ferrari and their best comrades from the battalions of youth attacked the Blaisborn power station near Anzin. From 1941 until June 6, 1944, we had to carry out unusual missions to destroy our own industrial base, our power plants, as long as they did not serve the enemy. At the same time, such operations, compared to the aerial bombardment of the Allied Air Force, we carried out more effectively in the respect that civilians did not suffer. In Blaisborn, our youth managed to quietly remove the sentry and within a few hours to produce such destruction that the power plant was out of operation for several months. The local newspapers of the collaborators wrote about it. 12 men armed with Francier's automatic rifles caused material damage of several millions to the Blaisborn's power station. Unfortunately, none of our 7 valiant comrades had automatic rifles. After the operation at the Blaisborn power station, Jules Bridoux was sentenced to death in absentia by the court, and on November 15, Félicien Joly, Morps d'Or from Valenciennes, Jean Dubois from Brou-sur-Escaut, Roger Seradiac from Brou, and Charles Robiquet from Valenciennes was shot. The Abbé Marquand, whom Joly asked for only one thing, to give a farewell letter to the young communists. I will always have wonderful memories of Félicien Joly. It was a man which I have met few and probably even less will meet in my lifetime. In Paris, the occupiers were faithfully served by such blood dogs as David Rott, Boughton, Tissot, Delarue. In the Department of Nord by Commissaire Rigel, who put all his police knowledge and experience at the service of the occupiers. He and his handmaidens tortured the arrested patriots to death, endeavouring to compel them to give the names and addresses of their comrades. But the predatory beast Rigel failed to capture the fighters who fought under the leadership of Ferrari. Then Rigel organised a vile campaign in the press, trying to portray our comrades as criminal offenders. The prefect of the Department of Nord, Charles, offered 100,000 francs to anyone who would extradite Eusebio Ferrari. The French police, the gendarmerie, the Gestapo were on a real hunt for this man in all the towns of the Nord Department. We decided to move all these comrades to other departments. Jules Bridoux went to the Somme as departmental commissioner of the Frontiers. Eusebio Ferrari, René Dennis and Armand Pawlowski did not want to leave their native places, although they were constantly threatened with death. One day, René Dennis met Eusebio Ferrari in one of the towns of the Sambre River Basin, where he had moved in connection with the persecution organised by the police, and reported that the traitor who had betrayed Félicien Joly was walking free. Ferrari was eager to avenge, together with René Dennis, the murder of his brother in the struggle. Henry Five, the Communist Party commissioner, tried to dissuade Ferrari. "They are looking for you, Eusebio. Don't you realize that this traitor is just a decoy? Let René Dennis act alone." Ferrari did not want to listen to anything, so filled was he with feelings of love for Félicien Joly. With his comrade B, he set out for Valenciennes, where Dennis and Pawlowski were to join them. In Burgos-sur-l'Escaut, at this time a police raid was in progress. The gendarmes searched house after house and finally surrounded the one in which Eusebio and B had taken refuge. With a revolver in his hand, he let out into the street. Suddenness played its part. They opened fire on him, but the bullets missed him. Taking advantage of the confusion, Eusebio Ferrari managed to escape. Together with B, he took refuge with a patriot. At this time, Armand Pawlowski and René Dennis arrived in the city. The police tried to detain them, but they defended themselves courageously and took refuge in some café. René Dennis deliberately delayed at the door to sacrifice himself, to give his comrade a chance to escape. Armand Pavlovsky jumped out of the window and made his way into the garden, but here he was struck down by a police bullet. Thus died both patriots. In his last refuge, Eusebio Ferrari changed into women's clothes and together with B, whom the police knew, tried to get out of the city. When it was only a short distance to the train station, Eusebio unexpectedly encountered a gendarme from Abscon, and the latter recognized him. Eusebio tried to flee, but the unfamiliar female clothing hindered his movements, and he was hit by an automatic rifle shot. February 16, 1942, was the day of the tragic death of the man who is now known as the legendary hero of the Nord Department. After the liberation of France, René Dennis and his comrades were posthumously honored. Here is the award characterization on the young communist René Dennis, a young Frenchman inspired by the finest patriotic feelings. In 1940 he rose to fight the invaders, courageous, disciplined, took part in numerous combat operations against the enemy. On February 16, 1942 fell to the death of a hero in an unequal fight with the enemy, showing the highest selflessness. Nazi terror, the extermination of dozens of the best patriots, Ferrari and his comrades, countered with an even more brutal struggle. On October 2, 1941, the newspaper Humanite reported that on September 26, 1941, 18 young active communists from the Department of Nord were shot, among them Jules Roquet from Orchies, Florentin Deleville from Rache, Florimond de Puriel from Rousse, Flory Durez from Orchies, Kleber Verraez from Saint-Lenoble, Louis Moreau of Vazières, Francois Coupe of Elby, Albert Foucault of Rousse, Louis Dessard of Brou, Jules Domis of Aniche, Alexis Valken of Rousse, Arthur Brunet of Denain, Adolphe Gaspard of Rousse, Victor Bansel of Fresnes, Edmond Devos of Valenciennes, Arthur Luchet of Drocourt, Leon Petitjean of Rouvroy, and Férien Turbult of Genin-Lietard. According to the Ministry of Justice, 1,100 persons were executed in the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. 218 persons were executed in Arras. On the tombstones there, the words communist and subversive can often be read. In the workers of the departments of Nord, Pas-de-Calais, and the Paris district were not alone in their struggle. In the same ranks with them in 1940 stood figures of science, culture, teachers and students. For François Mauriac, a major cultural figure and member of the French Academy, every volley of punitive commands and the shameful clang of Petain's guillotine resonated with pain in his heart. He himself was bullied in his own home by a Nazi soldier. In his book Black Notebooks, François Mauriac writes, "It was necessary to experience the gag and the iron collar, the extermination of entire races, the exile of the working class of Europe, childish agony, a horror unknown since the Assyrians, to revive the thirst for freedom in the hearts of peoples. And once again France has on her lips her eternal slogan. That slogan is liberty." Honoring the working class, the writer continues, "In fact, never in our history has man been reduced to such an insignificant position as in the period between these two wars. If we are to believe Nietzsche's words, man became strong only under conditions which are fundamentally opposed to the postulates of liberal civilization. What is the answer to him to this? Are we right to say that Western democracy has defended the human dignity, of which it proclaims itself today? The proletariat is the millions of slaves who suffered under the yoke of the bourgeoisie. Here, too, it was necessary to feel the depth of the abyss in order to regain hope. In its mass, only the working class remained faithful to France. As I write these lines, many French people are gripped by a primitive sense of fear. They do not want to admit it. They chant the sacred cult of the marshal, secretly invoke Joan of Arc. All their desires are reduced to one thing, to save their privileges, to avoid settling scores as long as the Germans remain here. Returning from the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais, I soon set out on a trip to the lands of François Mauriac in the neighbourhood of Bordeaux. I arrived there in the morning, saw the streets, the houses, the approaches to the station, and I was overcome by a feeling of deep sadness. It was as if the city had died out. I was unable to meet with the Inter-District Commissioner of the Union of Communist Youth, René Julien. He had been in an illegal situation since 1940, was arrested on July 23, 1941, and shot by the Germans on October 2000. I had to go to Mérignac. In a working-class suburb, I breathed easier. The sad mood that gripped me in Bordeaux gradually disappeared. On one of the streets of Mérignac, in a small house with a fenced garden, lived Gerard Blot, the courageous leader of the battalions of youth of the district of Bordeaux. He worked as a draftsman at the aircraft factory, which at that time produced airplanes, gliders, motors, and various spare parts for airplanes of German aviation. Gerard had 4 younger sisters and a brother. His father worked in the city hall for a meagre salary, so all of his older brother's money was needed to help the family make ends meet. Before going illegal in 1941, Gerard worked at a company where there was an active fight against the enemy, which cost the lives of dozens of patriots. In 1942, Henri Delris, Fernand Labris, René Rochereau, Louis Borna, Raymond Berge, Gabriel and René Castera, Gabriel Dupuis, Albert Dupeyron, Robert Eloise, Henry Fourcade, André Guérin, Gabrielle Jeanette and others were shot. The group, led by Gerard, conducted combat operations in terror until the liberation of the country. Gerard and his comrades worked closely with a group of postal workers in Bordeaux, whose leader was Monde, who was shot on April 30, 1942. Many refugees from Lorraine, especially from the Department of Meurthe and Moselle, joined the ranks of the Communist Youth Union's special organization of the Communist Party. Many of them died in Bordeaux or in concentration camps. Gerard Blayew organized several derailments of trains, carrying military supplies and miscellaneous materials on the Bordeaux-Paris line, as well as the destruction of transformers on the Libourne-Périgueux line. At his aircraft factory, as well as at the iron and steel works in the Bordeaux region, Gerard Blayew initiated numerous operations to undermine the industrial capacity at the service of the German army. Among all French cities, Bordeaux ranks second only to Paris in terms of the systematic and brutal nature of Nazi repression. Immediately after the arrival of the troops in Paris, the Gestapo established 2 centres, one in the capital, the other in Bordeaux. The centre in Bordeaux had the task of carrying out repression along the entire Atlantic coast and planting agents to oversee Vichy and the entire southern zone. Without delay, the French police placed themselves at the full disposal of the occupiers. On July 9, 1940, 2 weeks after the arrival of the Germans in Bordeaux, Commissaire Poinsot, the special commissioner in charge of liaison with the German commandant's office, wrote in his report that he had discussed with the occupation authorities matters concerning the communists, and in his opinion the German authorities intended to take preventive measures in this direction. Captain Hartmann asked if we had a list of French communists. To this I replied that if necessary we could provide the required information on the main activists. In the fall of 1940, 151 active communists were arrested and placed in a makeshift camp, set up in an abandoned wine warehouse on the Bataclan Quay. They were later transferred to Camp Merrick. Commissaire Poinsot served the enemy with great zeal, utilizing his experience. Hunting communists gave him sadistic pleasure. He was surrounded by executioners to match him. Everard, Celeria, Mornadar, round the clock they were busy arresting and torturing patriots. By the time they were released, these savages had 900 dead on their consciences. Such was the result of their activities. The services of Pinko and his gang were appreciated by the Nazis. And in the last months of 1944, these brutes continued their dirty business in Vichy, having moved there after the Gestapo. After the end of the war, almost all of them were detained in Germany, sentenced to death and shot a few days later. This was done hastily, because some feared that they might expose some of the major figures in industry, commerce, political administration of Bordeaux, who participated in the repression. One of the leaders of the Gestapo, Herbert Hagen-Amnogo, later state, "During my stay in Bordeaux, I had the impression that the population of southwestern France was hostile to the policy of cooperation being pursued. Communist activity was limited. Non-communist resistance, supported at the time by London, was also insignificant. The administration and police functioned normally. However, we had to act with caution because any public event, crudely conducted propaganda, hurt the French national feelings, and this caused passive resistance, which could turn into an active struggle." He could think of nothing better. One can imagine in what circles revolved the chief of the Gestapo. Poinsot and Doze led the mass arrests of communists and all those suspected of aiding and abetting us. Doze conducted an extensive roundup, leaving some of the people whose addresses he knew free. He then organized surveillance of them and arrested members of our organization. For this reason, we lost many valuable cadres in Bordeaux. We suffered an even heavier blow when Poinsot forced to work against us people who were involved in many cases in the Garonne. a former member of the Regional Teachers' Committee, Pierre Chiret-Wenson Piquet. Frightened of torture, they took the path of struggle against their brothers. Poinsot relied on the support of the municipal authorities loyal to him to carry out the repression. Mayor Adrien Marquet stated on September 18, 1904, "Thus analysis of the situation leads to a single conclusion. An English victory is impossible. Either on points or by knockout, Germany and Italy will defeat England." On February 1, 1941, he founded a neo-Nazi party, the Rassemblement National Populaire, together with Dia Rival Gu Gananx de l'Oncle, the former socialist minister Spinaz Lafayette, Soares, and several others. With the help of representatives of this party, as well as of the French People's Party and police agents who had infiltrated the Communist Party before the war, Poinsot obtained information about our people and organization. The prefecture of Bordeaux was actively cooperating with the occupiers. The head of the prefecture clerk's office persuaded his mistress, the secretary of the prefecture, to join a youth organization to gather information about the communists. In spite of the repression, one of the groups continued the struggle. It was made up of Spaniards. I salute its fighters, the fallen and the survivors. They led a cloistered life in the Spanish colony and were long out of reach of Poinco and the traitors in his service. This group was linked to another group, the Spanish Frontiereros from the Department of the Charente-Maritime, particularly Germain's group of 18 men. The youngest fighter, Pierre Matra, was 15 years old in 1941. Robert Lamorino and Gerard Breguier were 16. Helene Bolo was 17. Guinnett Robert and Marcel Bureau were 18. René Rocheteau was 19, Jean Besson, Roger Lemort, 20. Paul Allaire, André Cougrand, Roger Giraud, Albert Rufino, Jacques Lefort, 21, René Besson and Henry Bourgeois, 22, Paul Lamourette, 23, and Jean Buber, 24. Only 5 of them were destined to live to see the final battles of liberation. Many died in concentration camps in Germany, and of those who returned from there, very few survive to this day. Other groups were active in the neighbouring department of Charente of their large number. I will mention the group of Gisèle Robert, who in 1941 became a liaison for the Interregional Commissioner of the Special Organisation. In 1943 she was arrested and imprisoned in Roquet prison. We freed her during the Paris uprising. In those days I met Gerard Bleu for the last time. For many months he had been in an illegal situation. Hiding under an assumed name, he directed all the operations of the youth battalions of the Bordeaux area. But he was constantly haunted by an irresistible desire to see his family, to embrace his mother, to receive news about the little ones, about his father. And then one day he returned to Mérignac, breaking all the rules of conspiracy. The evil Nazi Poinsot made an accurate bet on Gerard's human feelings. He had been waiting for him for a long time, for many months, keeping tabs on his family. He was sure that Gerard would return here. On July 9, 1942, Gerard Bleu was supposed to meet his mother in Aquitaine, a large store of Mérignac. But no sooner had he hugged and kissed his mother than Poinsot's detectives pounced on him. After his arrest, he was subjected to particularly sophisticated torture, but learned nothing about the organization he led. On September 21, 1942, the Germans shot him. To combat the executioners who carried out bloody repression, the resistance leadership created its own counterintelligence. An 18-year-old girl, Francine Bonnet, provided us with invaluable help. Working as a typist in the police commissariat, she collected and passed on to us information about impending arrests and police informers. In this way we learned about the Grancleman case and the kind of meanness that a man of anti-communist views is capable of. Grancleman was the leader of a military resistance organization. Contrary to the rules of conspiracy, he kept a file on all the members of his organization, officially hiding under the name of a trading company. After his arrest, he did not hesitate to go into the service of the Gestapo and gave away all the members of the organization and warehouses of weapons delivered by plane from London. As a result of the betrayal committed by Grancleman, 100 people were imprisoned. Unfortunately, Grancleman was not the only resistance leader who took the path of betrayal. That is why Doze and Poinco came up with the idea of creating an organization of white partisans, ready to join the fight against the current Frontiereros, partisans, and all those who supported them. They believed that the most suitable territory for the realization of this sinister plan was Algeria. Colonel Tigner and Joubert were sent to North Africa. They were instructed to make contact with the British and Americans, posing as leaders of the resistance movement. As the historian Robert Aaron writes, Colonel Tyner and Joubert were transported across the Spanish border in the trunk of a car just up of its dose. On December 20, 1943, they arrived in Barriata. The onward journey took them through Iron and San Sebastian, and a few days later these strange pilgrims arrived in Algeria. On their own behalf and on behalf of the Gestapo, they outlined proposals for the deployment of resistance. But de Gaulle quickly realized who he was dealing with, and on his orders Tyner and Joubert were interned. So failed the operation with the organization of white guerrillas. Because of his past, Tyner could not in any way hold the post of head of the militant organization of the resistance. On November 18, 1940, as a commissioner of the Pétain government in the military tribunal of Périgueux-Aix, he participated in the trial of Yves Perron, a member of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, commissioner of the Underground Regional Organization. This is what he said at the time. I regret that under Articles 75 and 83, the maximum penalty that can be demanded is limited to only 5 years imprisonment, 10 years deprivation of residence, 10 years loss of civil rights and 10,000 francs fine. In the film If the French Knew, by André Garris and Alain Desadoui, the former regional commissioner of the resistance organization, the respected surgeon of Bordeaux, Dr. Quinault says with good reason that he is convinced that the 5 leaders of the military organization of the area, because of their anti-communist views, agreed to the combination proposed by the German Gestapo. Thus, anti-communism leads directly to treason. Grancleman and his resistance friends, like all those who followed the path of collaborationism for the same ideological reasons, are unworthy of any forgiveness. At all times, fascism's strategy has been to divide and isolate its irreconcilable enemies in order to destroy them. Despite brutal repression, in the face of mortal danger at every turn, the struggle in Bordeaux did not stop. One of the factories working for the German army was burned to the ground, organized several sabotage in Talents, at the aircraft factory in Beagle, at the submarine base. Many young people from the Gironde participated in the resistance. Some survived, most died. Paulette, a boy from Talents, was shot on March 15, 1944 in Munich. Aurora Pica from Weirs and André Tamise were killed in Auschwitz in 1943. Pierre Gemin from Caudreau was shot in July 1942. And Serge de Gouquet from Beagle on July 24, 1944. It is impossible to enumerate the many hundreds of remarkable sons and daughters of the Communist Party who died the death of heroes. It was they who made it possible to advance metre by metre, as André Brechet wrote about it in his suicide letter, and paved the way to freedom at the cost of their lives. He had the symbolic name Viala, like the young hero of 1793. When I met him in September 1941, he was staying with his grandmother in Angers, a beautiful villa drenched in greenery and flowers. The atmosphere in Angers was completely different from that in Bordeaux. Despite the hardships of the occupation, there was a sense of calm. Henry Viala worked at the main post office. He was secretary of the organization of the Communist Youth Union of the department and asked to be sent to the battalions of youth. His father, one of the founders of the communist organization in the department of Means-et-Loire, was arrested on June 6, 1941, and he decided to avenge him. In July 1940, Maurice Roquet was at the head of the FCP organization in the department of Means-et-Loire. He was joined by Marcel Paul, the Central Committee Commissioner in the departments of Brittany and the areas surrounding the Loire. When Maurice Roquet was arrested, he was replaced by Louis Martin, with Desire Legendre as his deputy. On October 5, 1942, Martin and Legendre were shot. Georges Fauveau, a member of the Union Council, formerly a fighter in the international brigades in Republican Spain, together with his deputy Joseph Leclerc, directed the special organization in the department of Meuse-et-Loire and conducted operations in a number of departments. Pierre Ribert, the first political commissar of the international brigades and a member of the Central Committee of the FCP, was in charge of all the work. He directed operations in all occupied departments in the west and southwest of the country. Arms, logistics and information gathering were the responsibility of Maximilien Pasquier. To name some of the many young men and women who took part in the fighting at the very beginning of Hitler's night: Marie-Françoise Pearson, a student; Jean Kommer, a student and artist; Young workers Didier, Joseph Leberton. At the very beginning, the most worthy of the young patriots joined the battalions of youth. Among them, undoubtedly, Jean Corvée, Raymond Porte, Émilie Cotant, Elie Pouchard, Francis Inizan, Camille Perdriault, François Ligiarda, Joseph Le Breton should be especially noted. Of the adults, let us name the wife of 4, who died in the camp and left behind 4 children aged between 5 and 12. Marcel Leffel and Marcel Sardo, heads of the departmental organizations of the FCPP. Bastiani, who provided liaison with the Sommer group led by Marcel Gaiman's wife, was in exile. Italian anti-fascist and member of the special organization Cagliati, died after returning from a concentration camp. Special organization members Alfred Seguin, Marcel Vien and Victor Bossier were shot on October 5, 1942. In these dark times, many students, educators and teachers in Angers, in Dijon and in many other cities rose to the defense of culture. Since 1941, young communists, in particular Marie-Francoise Persson, Helene Laurier and Robert Dean, had been working to create the United Front of Patriotic Youth, which later brought together young workers, teachers, students of teacher training colleges, craft schools, the medical school, the Catholic, faculty of the university and students from a number of lycees. A protest demonstration took place at the University of Angers during the arrival of the Minister of Youth from Vichy, a certain Lemirand. May 1, 1941 and the Feast of Joan of Arc were marked by 2 demonstrations in the streets of Angers. Patriots blew up the storefronts of the boards of French pro-Nazi organizations, and in 1941, 1942 and 1943 members of the Union of Communist Youth and the United Front of Patriotic Youth carried out a series of sabotage operations. In response, brutal massacres began. 14 students were arrested at the David Anguski Lyceum. René Brossard died of torture. Some of those arrested were released, and the students of the pedagogical department, André Moyne, René Porchet, Alfred Clement and André Tijoux, were shot in 1943. At the same time, Lyceum student Jean Roland was shot. In his suicide letter he wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad, after communion I am ready for execution. They're coming for me now. I am not destined to experience the many sufferings that could meet on my life path. I pity you most of all. Just think how many millions of fathers and mothers like you will be left alone with this damned war. Know that until my last breath I have not shed a single tear. My first wish is for you to be strong and be worthy of your Jean. One day you must die anyway. I wish I could die after you so as not to cause you grief. The most you could do for me is to be strong. Remember that every tear you shed would hurt me. When you have somewhat come to terms with what has happened, think of me being near my grandparents. My last thoughts are of you, dear Mom, dear Dad. Dear Jane, many young members of the United Front of Patriotic Youth sacrificed their young lives on the long road to liberation. On January 29, 1944, the young lycée Claude Katz died. He had participated in the liberation movement in Angers and then went to Grenoble and enrolled in an electrical engineering institute. When he was called to be sent to Germany, he went to the partisans. His parents were in hiding in Grenoble. They learned of their son's death on January 29, 1944. He had shed his blood in partisan battles on the snowy Malival Plateau in the Isy department. On February 23, 1944, his father was shot dead by the Gestapo in the middle of a street in Grenoble. The blood of Robert Dean, a young communist arrested in 1941, was spilled along with that of his brother in the struggle, Jean Roland. Robert Dean was shot on October 5, 1942, at Mont Valérien. He was also a student of literature and fine arts, a fighter in the first groups of the battalions of youth. Here is his farewell letter. My dear Papa, my dear Mother, my dear grandparents, my dear relatives and friends, I'm writing you a farewell letter. Tragic conditions turn a young man into a man. I am hurting you. Please forgive me for not being destined to fulfill all the hopes you had for me. They will disappear, but I have no regrets. Love me as you have always loved me, as I have loved you and continue to love you until my last breath. I will be worthy of you, worthy of my kindness. The only thing I reproach myself for is making my daddy and mommy cry. Cry, 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 but I beg you, let your courage be the same as mine. I beg you to be comforted. Live and keep the memory of me alive. Live for me. Papa, I trust you with my mother. She will suffer so much it makes me fearful. But you stay, you must save her, you must explain everything to her, bring her back to life. Tell her that I loved her as seldom has a son ever loved his mother. I do not leave you alone. You must protect your wife, my immensely dear mother. She must also protect you, my adored father. Besides this, you have other relatives. You are surrounded by friends. May you be surrounded by things, living things that remind you of me, that tell you about me. I should say so many things. I can't remember, the words slip away. Although I have a firm hand at this tragic moment, it is difficult to find the right words. Only silence, only looks can be understood. I look at you, my dad and mom, because you are by my side until the last minute you will be by my side. I love you, Daddy. I love you, Mom. I love all of you. There's nothing more I can say. Courage, Father, you know what courage is, you'll understand. I'm giving you my hand, my young hand. But it's strong. I don't want your hand to tremble. I want to feel your strong hand in my hand. After this man's handshake, I will leave with clear eyes, with a clear conscience, brimming with hope for the rest of you, for a more beautiful and happy world from which death will be banished. I leave upon you another young creature who I've loved more than myself, Pauline. Love her as your own daughter. I counselled her to love you and be a comfort to you. Help her. She needs you so she can go on with her life. It's a beautiful road, but it's a hard one. I fell at the beginning of the road. And Mom, Pauline, all of you must reach the end of the road, and for me because you love me. Goodbye. I want to be buried in my town next to my relatives. Give my library and my notes to Pauline. That's my wish. Try then to publish some of the compositions I wrote. In them was the purpose of my life. I wanted to live for my art even at the last minute of my life. Goodbye, Dad, Mum, Grandpa, Grandma, Josette, uncles, aunts, relatives, friends, Minot. Goodbye, Pauline, words are helpless. My last cry is a cry of love. Courage. Papa, here is my last kiss, the strongest from your fervently loving son. Farewell, everyone, your Robert. Love for freedom, love for the motherland, love for people, and first of all for the closest, relatives. These feelings were equally expressed by both Robert Dean and Jean Rowland, calling for an end to the despicable war. In addition to these names, many others could be mentioned, including communists who paved the way to peace and freedom in Angers. Among them was Moran-born Eugene Diguet, a fighter in the first groups of battalions of youth. He was arrested and died in a concentration camp. A young teacher from Montjean, Roger Mercier, a talented musician, initiator of the teachers' resistance movement of the Meun-et-Loire department. He was arrested in 1942, severely tortured, hospitalized in Nantes, then sent to the Majdanek death camp. The leaders of communist organizations Sado and Leffel, fearing that they could not withstand the torture and talk, took poison and died the first night in prison. A fighter of the first combat groups of the Frontier, Raymond Duquesne, fell from the bullet of a despicable policeman, a traitor to the motherland, when in December 1942 he set fire to a German forage warehouse. This was how the struggle was waged in the cities. But it was also fought in the countryside. In the small village of Pleasy-Mays on the farm gullet, our first Frontier father and son alike hid underground fighters. For their devotion to the national ideal, whose bearer for them was the FCP, they gave their lives. Oscar Gero had been leading one of the groups of the special organization since November 1941. He was arrested and sent to Mauthausen, where he died. In September-October 1941, Henry Viola took the path of struggle. The supports of high-voltage lines were blown up. The number of sabotage on railroads was growing. The largest instructive sabotage of that time is undoubtedly considered to be the one that was organized near Angers on the line Nantes, Paris. The Echelon was en route to the Soviet front. Many Hitler's soldiers did not get to the steppe expanses, did not meet Soviet troops and Russian partisans. Their way ended in Angers. Dozens went to the hospital without seeing enemy soldiers. Everyone realized that on the way to the real front in this war, so different from all the others, on the side of the Soviet Union and England fought another front, the front of the people's struggle. Henry Viola rallied around him many patriots who assisted the special organization. Unfortunately, on December 13, 1941, the commissioner of the special organization, Georges Falveau, was arrested at his safe house in the Exillois arrondissement of Paris. Not waiting for him at the agreed meeting place on December 15, Pierre Robert went to his home, where he was also detained. Georges Falveau inadvertently kept an account of the gift he had given to the owners of the safe house. One of the heads of the Paris Gestapo, Thomas, and the chief of the Special Brigades, David, with his horde rushed to Anjou. So was arrested on December 21, 1941, Henry Viala. This was a serious blow to the entire organization in the southwest and in the lower Loire. Following this, Claudine Dean and her son Robert, Louis Martin, Désiré Legendre, Alfred Seguin, Edouard Didier, Pierre Saurin, Joseph Leclerc, René Noël, Marcel Vigne, Victor Bossier, René Tranchant, Maximilien Pasquier fell into the clutches of the enemy. Because of their own recklessness, Albert Dupré, René Dufault, FCP, Commissioner Antoine Emerin, Rochereau, Vincennes, Guibert, Pierre Payas, Manem, Gillord, and Maupuin were arrested in the southwestern district. All patriots joined the struggle in place of those who had fallen out of the ranks. After the arrest of Georges Falveau, Maurice Ginot became the head of the interregional leadership. Despite the numerous arrests in all departments of the interregion, he managed in a few months to make it so that in all departments the enemy received new blows. Thanks to extreme bravery and great intelligence, Maurice Ginord managed to restore the fighting capacity of the organization. Guerrilla warfare spread as far as the forests of the Vendée. In 1942, a non-commissioned officer of the old army led one of the groups of frontiers and partisans. He became one of our best combat commanders. When the struggle in Anjou unfolded, we sent him to Orleans to organize actions in the departments of Cher, Nièvre, Loire, and Cher, Indre, and Loire. The image of this commander I have forever preserved in my memory, but all the best features that distinguished the first sons of the night merged in the image of Henry Weil. I have rarely met a comrade endowed with such a profound humanism, which he gave to the service of a great ideal. I had 2 meetings in the department of the Seine-Maritime, one at Rouen and the other at Le Havre. The peculiarity of this department is that it unites 2 quite different parts, the Havre and Rouen district. In Rouen, on the Seine-Quay, I met the Lycée girl Claudine Guérin. She was the first of the girls to lead a unit of the Frontières. I was very impressed with her. After talking to her, I met with 2 communist teachers and discussed with them the question of Claudine's studies. This did not meet the requirements of conspiracy, but in a dark age much could not be formally squeezed into any rigid framework. In Le Havre I was struck by the complete destruction of whole neighbourhoods. André de Reimer, the commissioner of the battalions of youth in the department of the Seine-Maritime, together with his deputy in Rouen, Claudine Guérin, and such valiant activists as Armand Duvivier, Jean Petit, Maurice Lemaire from Amiens, and Marcel Denis from Creil, who had previously worked in the area, gradually turned this department and then the entire interregion into a zone of active operations. Here the enemy could not feel at ease day or night. This interregion could be compared to such departments as Nord and Pas-de-Calais in terms of the strength of the blows inflicted on the enemy, the number of which increased every week. Because André Duromier had good organizational skills, was brave and skillfully led combat operations. In 1943 he was appointed my deputy in charge of operations in the National Directorate, and then commander of the Frontières and Partisans of the Paris area. His commissar was Adolphe Liga. But alas, the barrage that hit our headquarters in the spring of 1944 took André Duromier with it. He was deported to Neuengamme, as the Nazis were forced at that time to relax repression due to the intensification of our strikes. André Duromier was lucky enough to return alive from the concentration camp and is now the mayor of Le Havre. André's father, Eugene Duromier, was a long-time Communist Party activist. An artisan roller by trade, he made bombs for all the combat groups of the Frontières in his workshop. The Nazis arrested him and shot him. One of the streets of Le Havre is now named after him. A considerable intensification of the struggle in the department of the Seine-Maritime was observed from the beginning of 1940. The leaders here were André Pican and Georges Desire. The interregion was led by Paul Lemarchand and after him by Opost. The prefect at that time was Roger Verlum. There were not many prefects at that time who had the courage to remain in their posts and not accept to serve the occupiers and the Vichyistes. He posted the messages of the German commandant's office without any explanation, while other prefects did not stop before any meanness, just to gain favour with the Germans. For such actions, Roger Verlum was quickly removed from his post and sent to economic work in Goen. In October 1941, 600 communists were arrested in that department alone. Their failure was our fault, for the resistance organization had become massive and the security of its members had not been adequately addressed. Despite the arrests, the struggle continued to develop in 1940 and early 1941, with frequent strikes, demonstrations of the unemployed and housewives in front of city halls and prefectures. The armed struggle did not cease either, with self-defense groups forming within the special organization. Gontran Palit, in his book entitled Rouen and the Rouen District during the occupation of 1939-1940, showed how three communists, Pierre Corneau, Joseph Legendedown and Camille Pochet, on January 20, 1941, seized a warehouse of automatic weapons and grenades stored in the hangar of the port of Rouen on the Quai Gaston Boulet and transported these weapons to the Rue Courtois. In this way, the special organization and the battalions of youth had their first armory of their own. Unfortunately, on September 9, 10 and 11, 1941, these comrades were arrested and shot, one in Mont Valérien, the other two in Rouen. On April 17, 1941, Joseph Madec, a party activist from the first groups of the special organization, cut the cable linking the commandant's office in Le Havre with the headquarters of the occupation forces in Paris. He was arrested and shot on May 18, 1941. In addition to André Durema, there was a whole host of young heroes in Le Havre. Among them, a 20-year-old teacher, Michael Musard, a graduate of the Pedagogical Institute, a member of the Union of Socialist Youth. He often visited the federal head of the FCP, teacher André Pican. At the end of 1938, he had to feel ashamed of the position taken by the socialist members of parliament. 156 out of 157 socialists then voted in favour of Hitler's Munich dictate and handed over the unfortunate Czechoslovakia to the Nazis. Only one socialist deputy, Bagay, voted with the communists. Musard disagreed with the mean consolation that the socialist leader spoke of at the time. Turning to André Pican, he said, "Accept me into the Communist Party. I will not be able to forgive them Munich." After that, Michel took the path of struggle. He was one of the first volunteers of the battalions of youth. In 1941, there was a threat of his arrest, so he had to go into hiding. The Vichyists could not arrest him and sentenced him in absentia to 20 years of hard labour. This was on October 8, 1941, and on January 15, 1942. Another 15 years was added to this sentence. Michael Muser was one of our ringleaders, the leader of daring operations. We sent him always to difficult areas, entrusted him with the most responsible tasks. He was responsible for the actions of battalions of youth in the department of the Somme, then led the strike groups of the Paris area. We were very short of weapons, and Muser was the first to get them. In the Champflon area, there were warehouses of weapons not sent to the Spanish people because the Spanish War was over. Pierre Gauchard, a prominent communist in the department of Josta Froissart, the head of the interregion and the head of the organization of the Union of Communist Youth, managed to give us the information that allowed us to take possession of these weapons. Michel Mausert and Albert Guesquin carried out the task brilliantly. Michael was subsequently appointed head of the interregion, which included the departments of Menes-et-Loire, Vendée, Dax-Sèvres, Vienne, Sarthe, Mayenne and part of occupied Indre. He joined the glorious cohort of leaders of the resistance, whose solid foundations were laid by Colonel Fabian, Colonel Gilles, Debarge, Ferrari, Vincennes Feiter, Jean Robert, Maurice Lebert, Guy Gaultier and hundreds of other heroes who stood at the very origins of the active struggle. Michael Musard was arrested by the Gestapo in Angers and shot in 1943. It is impossible not to remember now many comrades, even if some forget to do so, as courageous and active organizers of the fighting since the beginning of 1940. Gustave Alice was among a small group at the beginning of 1940 that was reorganizing the work of the party and trade union organizations for underground action. I got to meet this remarkable comrade once more during the Paris uprising, with his arm in a sling at the head of his unit. The bank clerk Leon Liu was one of the first to be shot in Rouen on October 14, 1941. Since July 1940, he had been creating youth organizations with Jean Gasco, Toulouzan, Lionel Dewey, Emile Famery, Charles Domoredo, and Leon Gauchecon. In August 1940, in the Rouen area, Jean Delattre, Lucien Ducastel, and Francis Lemonnier gathered the activists of the Union of Communist Youth Organization and discussed with them the struggle against the occupiers. The Desoubre sisters had been putting up posters, announcements, and distributing leaflets since July 1940. They also helped us to harbour the Frontiers when one sensational operation was being prepared in Paris. Jean de Latreille was arrested in 1940 for distributing leaflets, sentenced to 13 months in prison, released in 1941, arrested again by the Germans and shot. From the first months of the occupation, Francis Lemonnier was in an illegal situation. The police failed to arrest him. Then the police captured his younger brother Guy and placed him in a penal colony. Arthur Lefebvre of Montigny printed newspapers and leaflets. He was arrested on November 20, 1940, and shot on February 21, 1942. On October 21, 1941, de Mersman of Gruny, Germani of Rouen, and Dolit of Ampreville were arrested. Henry Messager, a member of the Federal Bureau of the FCP, miraculously escaped arrest until February 18, 1942. On September 21 of the same year, he was shot. Godot, of the Construction Workers' Union in Darnetal, was handed over to the Germans and shot. Jean and Henri Ferraud from Le Havre were arrested at the end of 1940 for distributing leaflets. During the funeral of Plungenon, a member of the Communist Youth Union, friends placed a pillow with a red bow on his grave. The young communists Father Georges Plongenon and Jules Latrode were arrested. Also the arrests, the pillow, and many leaflets found in the neighbourhood where they lived. A report from the Neighbourhood Police Commissioner has a description of how Roger Levedre and his mother were arrested. On December 5, 1940, after a skirmish in which German soldiers were involved, German gendarmes searched the apartment of Levedre's widow, who lives in Le Havre, on Rue Belleau. During the search, they found 4 copies of the newspaper Humanite for October 1940, made on a rotator. In addition, a lot of paper that could have been used to print leaflets was found. Roger Levedre was reportedly a prominent figure in the Communist Party until its dissolution. He was secretary of the party cell on the ships of the Transatlantic Company, volunteered to fight in Republican Spain. After demobilization in September, he was not openly engaged in party work. However, there is every reason to believe that he did not cease his activities, but simply took the necessary precautions to ensure that he was not exposed. On December 5, 1940, Roger Levedre was extradited to the Nazis, and on February 14, 1942, he was shot. Bernard Mazet from Bolbec was arrested in April 1941. The communist railroader from Sotteville, Antoine Bruneau, was arrested on June 12, 1941. Henry Villard was arrested in March 1941, and Valentine and Guillaud from Grand Quevilly were convicted in the same month. However, many hundreds of active communists remained in the ranks. The number of communists who took part in the most varied forms of struggle grew daily. Ernest Vanier in Elbeuf, Marcel Couturier and Olga in Barantin, Peter in Dieppe. Fernand Châtel, now a correspondent for Humanit, was one of the leaders of the battalions of youth, the special organization, and then the French Frontiers partisans in the Department of the Seine-Maritime. In addition to him, the leadership included André Duréma, Michel Missard, and Claudine Guérin. In 1941, the number of strikes against the enemy increased, and the armed struggle and the resistance in general took new forms. On June 23, 1941, the railroad workers of Salteville-les-Rouen held a major manifestation of solidarity with the Soviet Union and its struggle. They realized that both their fate and the future of France depended crucially on the outcome of this struggle. A group of young Bretons organized the explosion of a compressor in Cartier-Marais and put local businesses out of action for a long time. On August 30, 1941, a railroad line in Grand Quevilly was blown up in the section known as the Bridge. The next day, an explosion occurred on the Rouen-Amiens line. On September 6, 1941, Henri Meimy and Robert Chevroyer assassinated a German soldier working at the headquarters of the occupation forces. A large cash reward was paid for the attempted assassins to be handed over to the authorities. On September 9, 1941, Lieutenant Pierre Cornu of the French Navy took out German military equipment in the Élysée camp. It was he and his communist friends who carried out a weapons seizure operation at Rouen on January 20. On September 13, the Nazi Victor Hole, an interpreter for the Noël Gendarmerie, was killed in Rouen. He helped the occupiers to identify active communists, participated in the arrests and torture of those arrested. On November 28, 1941, a young Breton railroader Lefebvre, who worked in Sainte-Ville-les-Roines, threw a bomb into the window of a German bookstore on Rue Jeanne d'Arc. In December 1941, Fernand Châtel and a Frenchman from Le Havre got into a real firefight with two Nazi soldiers. One soldier was killed, the other. Also in December 1941, a German bookstore on the Rue de Paris in Le Havre was bombed. The bomb for this was made by Eugene de Romier. On January 19, 1942, philosophy professor Valentin Feldman and Le Messier smashed the window of a photography studio on Rue Lafayette in Rouen. The window was filled with photographs of German officers and soldiers. In the broken window, the Patriots put a poster with the inscription, "At a time when our prisoners are languishing in Germany, one cannot look without indignation at the faces of prisoners displayed in a place of honor in French showcases." On February 23, 1942, a group led by Michel Musard and Jean Gasco threw grenades at a German unit passing along a street in Le Havre. Many occupiers were killed and wounded. On March 21, 1942, a German sentry was killed in Elbeuf. The communist organization was led by Ernest Vanier and Henry Levelin. In the same month, Michel Musard, Lemonnier, and other franc-tireurs near Barentin derailed a German train. The department of Seine-Saint was one of the areas of greatest activity of the resistance movement. This is evidenced, in particular, by the fact that in the Cane Valley alone, 38 people fell victim to repression, 10 of whom were shot and 28 of whom died during combat operations and in concentration camps. Gustave Delarue was one of the founders of the party organization in this part of the valley, a municipal councillor of Eaume. In 1939 he was arrested, sent to prison in Alençon, and from there to the Campine camp and shot. Roland Durieux was secretary of the organization of the Union of Communist Youth of the department. In 1936, at the age of 16, he joined the Union of Communist Youth in Malone. From 1940, he took part in the distribution of illegal materials calling for the struggle against the occupiers and the Vichyists. On September 27, the French police arrested him. A special court in Rouen sentenced him to 4 years in prison. He was then transferred to Poissy and shot by the Germans on April 25, 1942. Lucien Tessel continued the struggle, conducted sabotage work at the metalworking enterprise in Deville, which fulfilled orders from Hitler's Wehrmacht. Before he was shot, he wrote the following letter: "Let there be red flowers on my grave, as red as my blood, which I will spill for all, for the French land and for the Russian steppes. Let them remember me sometimes, and let life go on." Lucien Tessel, a young metal worker from Deville, and Valentin Feldman, a philosophy professor from Dieppe, died together at Mont Valérien on June 27, 1942. Since 1940, 10,000 of their comrades in struggle had been shot in this hilly area. Before his execution, the communist Valentin Feldman addressed the punishers in German with the following words, thus emphasizing the international and humane nature of our struggle. "Gang of Mand. Now we will die not only for our cause, but for you all." Yes, Normandy can be proud of its sons. They remained faithful to their father Milon, the mountain of Guy de Maupassant's story. In July 1941, the leadership of the FCP published in a separate booklet this short story by the great writer, which tells the story of a Normandy peasant, a Francier in 1870. This old man went out every evening on the bumpy roads of grove-covered Normandy to spur on his Prussian. Only one thought lived in him, and to avenge his son and father. He was captured, interrogated by a German colonel. "What else would you like to say?" "I have nothing more to say. I have paid in full. 16 dead, not one more, not one less." "Do you know that you will die?" "I have asked no mercy from you. My account is simple, 8 enemies for my father, as many for my son. Did I come to your country with weapons in my hands? I didn't know you at all. I didn't even know why you were here. And now you've broken into my house and you're running around here like you own the place. I have avenged myself on others, and I do not repent of it at all." So said a Norman patriot in 1870. Today's Normandy was true to him.